They called it the stupidest thing they'd ever seen. A maze of wooden walkways stretching across the snow-covered pasture, rising 3 feet above the ground like some mad carpenter's fever dream. Caleb Thornfield hammered another support beam into place, while his neighbors gathered at the fence line, pointing and shaking their heads. "That man's lost his mind," Marcus Wells muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Wasting good lumber on nonsense." But Caleb kept building, board by board, beam by beam, creating corridors that twisted and turned through his property in patterns that made no sense to anyone watching. What they didn't know was that in 3 days, when the temperature dropped to 70 degrees below zero, those wooden pathways would be the only thing standing between 400 head of cattle and certain death. The morning air bit sharp against Caleb's weathered face as he measured another section of pine planking. His breath formed white clouds that froze before hitting the ground, and ice crystals clung to his mustache like tiny diamonds. He'd been working since dawn, just as he had every day for the past 2 weeks, methodically constructing what the townspeople had dubbed his fool's maze. "Papa, maybe we should listen to Mr. Wells," Tommy said, balancing a bundle of boards on his shoulder. The 16-year-old's voice carried doubt that cut deeper than any winter wind. "All this lumber cost us near everything we saved." Caleb paused his hammering and studied his son's face. The boy had been loyal, helping without complaint, but Caleb could see the uncertainty growing stronger each day. Every snicker from the neighbors, every whispered comment about crazy old Thornfield, chipped away at Tommy's faith in his father's plan. "You see them cattle out there, son?" Caleb nodded toward the pasture where their herd grazed in the protected valley, black dots against white snow, moving slowly through the sparse grass they could still reach. "Come next week, they won't be able to move at all. Snow's gonna be deeper than a man's waist, maybe deeper than his head." Marcus Wells rode up closer to the fence, his horse snorting steam in the frigid air. "Thornfield, you're building walkways to nowhere. Them cattle can't climb up on those contraptions like circus animals." Other ranchers had gathered now, forming a small crowd of skeptics. They sat their horses like judges, watching Caleb's every move with amusement that bordered on cruelty. These were practical men who'd survived harsh winters, using methods their fathers and grandfathers had trusted. They saw Caleb's elevated pathways as the desperate folly of a man who'd been isolated too long. "Those walkways connect to ramps," Caleb called back, his voice steady despite the mockery. "Gentle slopes the cattle can manage. Lead right to the barn where they'll stay warm and fed." "Warm and fed," Wells repeated with a harsh laugh. "While the rest of us are losing stock to natural winter, you're playing carpenter. Hope your wooden maze keeps you company when them cattle freeze anyway." But Caleb had stopped listening. His attention had turned to the western horizon where dark clouds gathered like an approaching army. The weather signs he'd been tracking for weeks were finally aligning. Tomorrow, the barometric pressure would begin its fatal drop. And then everyone would understand why he'd built his maze. The wind shifted that afternoon, carrying a scent that made Caleb's stomach clench with urgency. Not the clean smell of snow, but something else. Something that spoke of violence waiting just beyond the mountains. He'd learned to read these signs 20 years ago, from an old-timer who'd predicted the worst blizzard in territorial history 3 days before it hit. Now that same knowledge screamed warnings in his head. Tommy hammered steadily beside him, but Caleb could feel his son's growing frustration with every missed nail. The boy didn't understand that each board, each connection, was a lifeline they desperately need. How could he explain that the maze wasn't random, that every turn and angle had been calculated to channel wind and create pockets of warmer air? "We're running out of lumber," Tommy announced, setting down his hammer with more force than necessary. "And Johnson at the mill won't extend more credit. Says you already owe him more than most folks see in 2 years. The words hit harder than the cold. Caleb had mortgaged nearly everything to buy the materials for this project, betting their entire future on something no one else believed in. His wife's jewelry, sold. The good horses, traded for pine planks. Even the silver dollars they'd saved for Tommy's future had gone to purchase nails and rope. From across the field, Marcus Wells continued his commentary for anyone within earshot. "Look at him now, dragging that poor boy into his madness. Thornfield's gonna lose everything, and for what? Some wooden snake that don't lead nowhere useful." But Wells didn't see what Caleb saw when he looked at those walkways. In his mind, he could picture the cattle moving single file through the protected corridors, shielded from winds that would kill them in minutes. He could see them reaching the safety of the barn while other herds perished in the open range. "Papa," Tommy's voice had dropped to a whisper. "What if they're right? What if we're just throwing away everything Mama worked for? The question struck deep, because Caleb had asked himself the same thing every night for 2 weeks. Sarah had scrimped and saved for years to build their nest egg, taking in sewing and selling eggs to neighboring ranches. Every dollar he'd spent on lumber was a piece of her sacrifice. And if he was wrong, if the maze failed, he'd have destroyed everything she'd worked to build. Your mother understood taking calculated risks, Caleb said finally. She'd rather see us try something bold than play it safe and lose anyway. A sharp crack echoed across the valley as the wind snapped a branch from the old oak near the house. The sound made both father and son look up at the sky, where clouds had thickened considerably since morning. The temperature was dropping faster now, and Caleb could feel the atmospheric pressure changing in ways that made his old injuries ache. "How much more do we need to finish?" Tommy asked, following his father's gaze toward the incomplete sections of walkway. Caleb calculated quickly. 3 more support beams, 20 feet of planking, and the final connection to the barn ramp. With the lumber they had left, they might finish by tomorrow evening if they worked through the night. But that assumed everything went perfectly, and winter storms had a way of making perfect plans impossible. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but it wasn't summer thunder. This was the low, ominous sound that preceded the kind of storm that could bury a ranch under 10 feet of snow in 12 hours. They had maybe 36 hours before the real test began. By lamplight, the maze looked even more bizarre, casting twisted shadows across the snow that writhed like living things. Caleb's hands had gone numb hours ago, but he kept working, driving nails by feel and instinct. Tommy worked beside him without complaint now, perhaps sensing the desperation that had crept into his father's movements. The wind had picked up substantially, rattling the completed sections of walkway and making the oil lamps flicker dangerously. Each gust tested the joints and connections Caleb had spent weeks perfecting, and he found himself holding his breath every time the structure swayed. "It's holding," Tommy said, more to reassure himself than his father. But Caleb heard the uncertainty underneath. They were using green lumber, wood that hadn't had time to properly season, and the rapid temperature changes were causing it to contract and expand unpredictably. A sharp crack split the night air, and both men froze. One of the support posts near the middle section had split along its length, sending a 20-foot section of walkway sagging toward the ground. The cattle trail that Caleb had so carefully calculated now dipped at a dangerous angle that could trap or injure the animals it was meant to save. "That's it," Tommy said, exhaustion making his voice harsh. "We don't have enough good lumber left to fix that and finish the connection to the barn. We have to choose." Caleb stared at the damaged section, his mind racing through options. He could reinforce the broken post with the lumber they had saved for the final connection, but that would leave the maze incomplete, ending nowhere. Or he could finish the route to the barn and hope the damaged section would hold long enough for the cattle to cross. From the house, a warm glow beckoned through frost-covered windows. Sarah would have had hot coffee waiting and blankets by the fire. She would have urged him to come inside, to accept that some battles couldn't be won with determination alone. But Sarah wasn't here to voice those concerns. And Caleb knew she wouldn't have wanted him to quit when so much was at stake. "Fetch the rope from the barn," he told Tommy. "We're going to reinforce that post with cross-bracing and pray it holds." "Papa, that post is cracked clean through. Rope ain't gonna—" "It'll hold," Caleb cut him off. "It has to hold." But as Tommy trudged toward the barn, Caleb caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Marcus Wells stood at the property line with 3 other men, all holding lanterns and gesturing toward the maze. They'd been watching the work, waiting to see if Caleb would fail, waiting to be proven right. When Tommy returned with the rope, the neighbors had moved closer, and Caleb could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. Words like "stubborn fool" and "bringing ruin on his family," and "someone ought to stop him before he gets that boy killed too." The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. They weren't just watching anymore. They were considering intervention, possibly convincing Tommy that his father had lost his mind completely. And looking at the damaged walkway swaying in the lamplight, at the incomplete connections and questionable lumber, Caleb couldn't entirely blame them for their concern. But what they couldn't see was the wall of clouds building beyond the western peaks, clouds that held more snow than the valley had seen in living memory. What they couldn't know was that in 18 hours, their traditional methods of wintering cattle would become death sentences. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 28 degrees below zero when Caleb woke before dawn. But with the howling wind, the air felt much colder. He'd managed 3 hours of sleep on the floor beside the fireplace, his clothes still damp with sweat and snow from the night's work. The cracked support post had held through the night, reinforced with rope and cross-bracing, but it remained the weakest link in a chain that needed to be absolutely perfect. Tommy was already up, stoking the fire with mechanical movements that spoke of exhaustion deeper than mere tiredness. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he added kindling to the flames. They had finished the connection to the barn just as the first fat snowflakes began to fall, but the victory felt hollow with so many uncertainties remaining. "It's starting," Tommy said, nodding toward the window where snow fell in thick, heavy curtains that swallowed the landscape whole. The flakes weren't the gentle crystals of an ordinary snowfall, but dense, wet clumps that would pack into impenetrable barriers within hours. Caleb pulled on his boots and coat, every muscle protesting from the previous day's labor. Outside, the wind had taken on a different quality, no longer gusty and unpredictable, but steady and relentless, driving the snow horizontally across the valley. The temperature would continue dropping throughout the day, and by evening they'd be facing conditions that killed exposed cattle in minutes, rather than hours. Through the driving snow, he could barely make out the dark shapes of their herd clustered in the protected corner of the pasture. 400 head of prime beef cattle that represented everything they'd worked to build over the past 15 years. If the maze failed, if his calculations proved wrong, they'd lose not just the animals but the ranch itself. The banknote was due in spring, and without cattle to sell, they'd have no way to make payment. "The Hendersons lost 12 head overnight," Tommy said when Caleb returned from checking the livestock. "Found them frozen stiff near the creek. Marcus Wells says it's gonna get worse before it gets better." The news hit like a physical blow. If experienced ranchers like the Hendersons were already losing cattle, the storm was more severe than even Caleb had anticipated. His maze would need to perform beyond his most optimistic calculations, and the margin for error had just shrunk to nothing. A heavy knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see Marcus Wells and 2 other men standing on the porch, their faces grim beneath snow-crusted hat brims. They'd come not as neighbors offering help, but as a delegation with serious business to discuss. "Caleb, we need to talk," Wells said when the door opened. "I've got room in my south barn for maybe 50 head. Your choice cuts. Let me help you save what we can before this gets worse. It's not going to collapse. That cracked post says different, and I've seen storms like this before. Lost half my herd in '73 to weather that started just like this. Tommy, your father's a good man, but pride can blind a person to real danger." The other men nodded agreement, their eyes fixed on Tommy rather than Caleb. They were trying to drive a wedge between father and son, convince the boy that his father's judgment couldn't be trusted when lives were at stake. "The cattle will be fine," Caleb said, but he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and the snow fell harder than any of them had ever seen. By midday, the thermometer had plummeted to 35 below zero, but the screaming wind made the air feel deadly cold, like breathing knives. The wind chill had to be approaching 70 degrees below zero. Caleb could no longer see the barn from the house, though it stood less than 100 yards away. The wind screamed across the valley with such force that it shook the cabin's foundation and rattled every window in its frame. Tommy pressed his face against the glass, trying to spot their cattle through the blizzard. "I can't see them anywhere," he said, his voice tight with worry. "What if they're already scattered? What if they can't find the entrance to your walkways?" The question struck at Caleb's deepest fear. All his planning had assumed the cattle would instinctively seek shelter when the storm hit, that their natural herding instincts would guide them to the maze entrance he'd positioned at the pasture's most protected corner. But if they'd panicked in the whiteout conditions, if they'd wandered away from the planned route, the entire system became useless. Marcus Wells had returned twice during the morning, each time with more dire reports from neighboring ranches. The Carlsons had lost 30 head. The Rodriguez family's entire herd was missing, likely buried under snowdrifts they'd never escape. Every piece of bad news was delivered with pointed looks at Tommy, reminders that traditional shelter methods, while not perfect, were at least proven. "Tommy, I've been ranching 30 years, lost cattle to storms that looked exactly like this one. Your father's not a fool, but sometimes good men make desperate choices that put everyone at risk. If those walkways collapse and cattle panic, they could stampede right through my fence line." "The walkway won't collapse," Caleb insisted, but his words lacked the conviction they'd carried days earlier. The cracked support post creaked ominously with every gust of wind, and the rope reinforcements looked increasingly inadequate against the storm's fury. "Look, I'm not trying to undermine you," Wells said, his voice softening slightly. "But I've seen what panic does to cattle in storms like this. Show me how this system is supposed to work, because right now I'm seeing expensive lumber that might trap animals instead of saving them." The dare hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Outside, the storm raged with intensifying violence, and visibility had dropped to mere feet. Venturing out in these conditions would be dangerous for humans, potentially fatal for livestock. But Caleb knew that refusing Wells's challenge would confirm every doubt his critics had voiced. "We wait until the wind dies down," Caleb said finally. "Moving cattle in this whiteout would be suicide. Or maybe you're having doubts too, and you're waiting to see if nature solves the problem for you." Tommy's head snapped up at those words, and Caleb saw something shift in his son's expression. The boy was beginning to consider that his father might actually be wrong, that pride and stubbornness had led them into a trap from which there might be no escape. The wind gusted again, harder than before, and somewhere outside came the sharp crack of breaking wood. Not rope this time, but solid timber giving way under stress it was never meant to bear. Through the window, they could see one section of the walkway swaying dangerously, its connection points straining against forces that seemed determined to tear the entire structure apart. "Papa," Tommy whispered, his face pale. "What if we're too late? What if it's already breaking apart?" The temperature gauge outside now read 42 below zero, but with the relentless wind, the chill felt far more brutal. The wind reached its peak fury just after 3 o'clock, transforming the world into a white void where visibility dropped to arm's length. The thermometer now read 45 degrees below zero, but with the howling gale, the wind chill had surely reached the 70 below that Caleb had predicted. Ice crystals formed instantly in the air, creating a sound like thousands of needles striking glass with each breath. Caleb forced himself outside to check on the cattle, roping himself to the porch railing so he wouldn't lose his way in the whiteout. The cold hit him like a physical blow, burning his lungs and making his eyes water so severely he could barely see. Through the driving snow, he searched desperately for any sign of their herd. Nothing. The pasture where 400 head of cattle should have been huddled for protection showed only endless drifts of white. No dark shapes moving against the snow, no sounds of lowing or hoofbeats. The animals had simply vanished into the storm, and with visibility this poor they could be anywhere within miles of the ranch. "They're gone," Tommy said when Caleb stumbled back inside, ice covering his mustache and eyebrows. "Aren't they? We've lost everything." Caleb couldn't answer immediately. His throat felt raw from breathing the Arctic air, and his hands shook as he tried to warm them by the fire. The possibility he'd refused to consider was now staring him in the face. If the cattle had scattered in panic when the storm hit, if they'd wandered away from the maze entrance in the confusion, then all his planning meant nothing. 400 head of prime beef could be freezing to death somewhere in the valley, while his elaborate walkways stood empty and useless. Marcus Wells appeared again at the door, this time with genuine concern written across his weathered features. "Caleb, I can't find my own cattle either. This storm's worse than anything we've seen. The Rodriguez family's already lost their entire herd, found them piled up against their fence line, frozen solid." The news hit like a hammer blow. If experienced ranchers like the Rodriguez family were losing everything, then Caleb's experimental system faced a test beyond anything he'd calculated. The maze wasn't just competing against traditional methods anymore. It was fighting for survival against conditions that were killing cattle regardless of preparation. "My offer still stands," Wells continued. "I've got that south barn cleared out, enough hay for 50 head. We could try to round up your best breeding stock, get them to safety while there's still time." But time was the one thing they no longer had. In this visibility, finding scattered cattle would be impossible, and driving them anywhere would be suicide for both animals and men. If the herd had found the maze entrance, they'd either survive the night or they wouldn't. If they'd wandered off in the wrong direction, then by morning there would be nothing left to save. "The walkways are still standing," Caleb said quietly, though he wasn't sure why it mattered anymore. Outside, something crashed in the wind, the sharp crack of wood splintering under forces too great to resist. Dawn came gray and muted, the storm's fury finally beginning to weaken, but leaving behind a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snow had drifted 15 feet deep in some places, completely burying fence lines and smaller outbuildings. The temperature had stabilized at 38 below zero, still deadly, but no longer dropping. Caleb emerged from the house into an alien world, following a rope he'd strung the night before toward where his maze should be. The walkways had survived the night, though several sections showed damage from the wind and the weight of accumulated snow. More importantly, he could hear something that made his heart race with sudden hope. Cattle. Low, rumbling sounds coming from somewhere ahead in the maze. "Tommy, bring the lantern," he called, his voice cracking with emotion he didn't dare trust yet. Following the walkway's elevated path through snow that would have been impassable at ground level, they made their way toward the barn. The wooden corridors creaked under their feet but held firm, the cross-bracing and support posts doing exactly what Caleb had designed them to do. The first cattle came into view like ghosts materializing from white fog. 12 head of his best breeding stock stood calmly in one of the wider sections of walkway, protected from the wind by the maze's walls and warmed by their own body heat trapped in the enclosed space. They looked tired but alive, their coats frosted but their eyes alert. "There's more ahead," Tommy whispered, pointing toward sounds coming from deeper in the maze. As they followed the walkway toward the barn, they found clusters of cattle at regular intervals, exactly as Caleb had hoped. The animals had instinctively sought the protection of the wooden corridors when the storm hit, and the maze's design had guided them naturally toward safety. But not all of them had made it. At one turn in the walkway, they found evidence of Caleb's worst fear realized. Deep grooves in the wooden planking showed where panicked animals had tried to turn around in the narrow space, and dark stains in the snow below suggested that some cattle had fallen or been trampled in the confusion. "How many do you think we saved?" Tommy asked, his voice carefully neutral. Caleb couldn't answer yet. They still had 3 more sections to check before reaching the main barn, and each turn might reveal either more survivors or evidence of greater losses. The maze had worked better than anyone had dared hope, but it hadn't been perfect. Nothing ever was when fighting against nature's raw power. Marcus Wells appeared at the maze entrance, having followed their tracks through the snow. His expression had changed completely from skepticism to something approaching awe. "I count maybe 300 head in these walkways," he called out. "Maybe more. How in the world did they know to come here?" "Cattle are smarter than most people think," Caleb replied, but his attention was focused on the barn ahead. Warm yellow light glowed through the building's windows, and the sounds from inside suggested it was full of livestock that had found shelter just as he'd planned. The real test would be the final count. But for the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself to believe that his stupid snow maze might actually have worked. The final count took most of the morning, but when Caleb and Tommy finished walking every section of the maze and checking every corner of the barn, the numbers told a story that left even Marcus Wells speechless. 378 head of cattle had survived the storm. Of the 400 animals Caleb had started with, only 22 were lost, and most of those had been weak or sickly animals that might not have survived an ordinary winter. "Impossible," Wells kept repeating as they stood in the barn doorway, watching dozens of cattle lined up single file through the wooden corridors. Steam rose from their warm breath in neat columns, while outside the devastated landscape showed nothing but white emptiness where other ranches had once grazed their herds. "How did you know this would work?" Caleb ran his hand along one of the maze's support beams, feeling the solid wood that had withstood forces that destroyed conventional shelters throughout the valley. "I didn't know. I just remembered what old Jake Morrissey told me about breaking up wind patterns and creating warm pockets. The maze doesn't just keep the cattle moving toward shelter. It traps their body heat and breaks the wind into smaller currents that can't carry away their warmth." Tommy walked up carrying a steaming cup of coffee, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and newfound respect. "Half the valley wants to know if you'll help them rebuild using your design. The Rodriguez family, the Hendersons, pretty much everyone who's left." The irony wasn't lost on Caleb. The same neighbors who'd called his project a fool's gamble were now asking to copy it, but there was no satisfaction in their desperation, only the sobering knowledge that families would be rebuilding their herds from nothing, while others came asking for help. "Course I'll help," Caleb said, "but next time, maybe folks will listen before the storm hits instead of after." Marcus Wells extended a work-roughened hand toward Caleb, his expression showing the kind of humility that comes from being completely wrong about something important. "I owe you an apology. More than that, I owe you thanks. Without that maze, we'd all be facing ruin come spring." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the sections of walkway that had taken damage during the storm and making sure all the surviving cattle had adequate feed and water. The maze had done its job, but maintaining it through the remaining winter months would require constant attention to prevent ice buildup and structural damage. As the sun set over the snow-covered valley, Caleb stood on his porch looking out at the wooden pathways that had seemed so foolish just days before. Steam still rose from the corridors, where his cattle moved safely through their protected world, while beyond the maze lay the white silence of a landscape stripped bare. The stupid snow maze had proven something that no amount of traditional wisdom could teach. Sometimes survival came down to one man's willingness to build what nobody else understood. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another tale where the craziest idea turns out to be pure genius, and one person's madness saves an entire community. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.